I want to take it back to the beginning. You mentioned lowering carbs. It sounded like protein was around 1 gram per pound of body weight, you recommended. And then fat. I want to zoom in on this aspect because you made it clear we just want to let that take care of itself as we're switching to this lower carb diet. There seems to be this divide in the keto world where some people say we want to up the fat. Let's talk about how you see people in that camp versus how you explained it.
Sure. So specifically focusing on the protein first, I had mentioned 1 gram per pound of body weight. That's a quote unquote optimal number, especially for athletes or people who are doing any type of exercise training. Higher protein quantities seem to be very beneficial for supporting muscle mass, muscle recovery from exercise. And those benefits seem to be maximized at that amount. You don't need to consume that amount. The RDA used to be 0.8 grams per kg, which was dramatically lower. Okay. What I'm talking about here is 2.2 grams per kg, which is quite a bit higher, over twofold higher. But again, that's mainly due to a lot of evidence supporting its role in muscle function, but also because protein also helps reduce hunger. So if you say set the calories at a set amount and you start replacing some fat and forms of carbohydrates for protein, your body can actually begin to benefit from a higher satiation or lower hunger from just having higher protein within that diet. It seems to be a unique molecule. It's also an essential form of our diet because you need to get essential amino acids from protein. But that addresses the protein quantity. You don't need 1 gram per pound of body weight or 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. But that's really the threshold for maximizing its benefits, particularly if you're an athlete or exercising in some form.
Okay, let me jump in before we go to fat because protein was another thing I wanted to make sure we hit on. It seems like in the keto world, maybe 5-10 years ago, this was more of a thing, but a lot of people in keto would recommend lowering protein because of gluconeogenesis. So talk about it from that angle and how you think about that.
Sure. So that's really a question of what's your priority? Is your priority to maximize body composition on this diet? Or is your priority to elevate ketone levels on this diet? They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they typically go antagonistic to one another. Meaning if you have very high protein quantities in the diet, protein does require insulin, okay? It's nowhere near as much insulin as carbohydrates. 1983 analysis by O'Deal and Collier actually explicitly showed this. You can take 50 grams of potato versus 50 grams of chicken breast, 50 grams of 50 grams of carbohydrates from a potato is going to require 2.5 times more insulin than 50 grams of a chicken breast, at least protein. So gram for gram, protein requires 2.5 times less insulin. It's a much slower elevation in glucose, much more persistent over time. Most people will never see the glucose elevation from this because they're not tracking the insulin response or glucose response from this. People with type 1 diabetes, which is a disease that I live with, you can see these changes because you see 24/7 glucose and insulin. But for the average person, they're never going to see a meaningful glucose elevation or insulin because they're not quantifying it from protein. But protein does require some insulin. So the higher the protein quantity, the more insulin. Again, nowhere near as much that would be the case on a higher carbohydrate approach, but it still requires more insulin, even though it's less. And the higher the insulin, the less fat breakdown and the less ketogenesis that's going to occur. If your priority is exercise training and adaptation, then getting protein is almost certainly more important than the level of ketone bodies in the blood. Okay, and particularly so for athletes. But if you have a neurological condition where ketone bodies play a particularly important role for brain energy metabolism or normalization of key symptoms within the brain, then you do want to prioritize ensuring that you are getting higher ketone levels, which means you need to be cautious of how high you put protein. Maybe you don't put protein as high. Maybe you back it off to ensure your ketone levels are sufficiently high for your set outcome. So it isn't one or the other. It's about the main goal. The majority of people listening to this, Jesse, right now, are people who probably want to improve their health as a number one goal. And two, maybe they want to lose weight because 7 out of 10 Americans have some form of obesity in the United States. So they're probably focused more so on their body composition for the average person, which is why the priority is typically, hey, focus on a protein dominant diet, high green leafy vegetables with higher fiber content, and allow for fat to just come along for the ride. Because if you just allow it to come along for the ride, you're not adding it on top of what you're already doing. If you add a ton of extra fat on top of the food you're already consuming, let's say you kept everything controlled and you just add fat on top of it, it adds a ton of calories. And a ton of calories is going to contribute to excess energy intake. Do you think that energy intake is going to magically evaporate into thin air? No. It's going to be processed by the body to either be stored or it's going to be put somewhere. It doesn't disappear. And so calories matter. I think there's a bit of a misnomer in the low carbohydrate ketogenic community that says, oh, fat won't spike insulin and calories don't matter. Fat does matter and it does contribute to calories, and calories are 100% important, in my opinion. Now, what is the controversy, and often I think miscommunicated out in the conversation around this, is that if people focus on higher fat diets, low carbohydrate, and having sufficient amounts of protein, then people inadvertently, volitionally, often caloric restrict. And so calories do become less relevant from a practical perspective, because you often see a lot of literature that shows that people just volitionally reduce their caloric intake. So yes, by default, it's becoming less relevant. And so from that perspective, people say, okay, it doesn't matter. And that's more of a practical mindset within that context. But if you kept calories identical in two different diets and you just start pouring fat on top of one of the diets, you will gain weight, probably fat. So you don't just want to add it on top on purpose. This was something that was pushed by a guy named Jimmy Moore like 10 to 15 years ago. And I don't think it's going to produce optimal outcomes for most people, but it's more about the balance and composition of the diet over the entire diet based on your goals. Again, talking about, okay, is your goal to optimize body composition, or is your goal to optimize, let's say, neurological benefits for a specific condition by elevating ketone bodies to a certain particular level? Or do you want to balance the two so you find a kind of an in-between period? So for myself, I have probably around 1 gram per pound of body weight of protein. I also exercise quite a bit, typically an hour and a half per day. And my ketone levels range anywhere from 0.3 to 1.5 per day. Okay, so I'm pretty much well in ketosis most of the day. I hit those protein thresholds. I exercise a lot and I'm very active, and I follow those guidelines, and I'm doing just fine. I compete in sport. I'm a father, a husband. I'm a researcher. A whole lot of things, and I'm trying to balance myself. Sometimes I lose my mind trying to do these things, admittedly. But either way, at the same time, it's doable, and it's all within the context of the overarching goal. So it's all along the spectrum. Maybe is a better way to describe it. You can push high protein, high. Maybe you reduce ketone bodies a little bit, and you reduce ketone bodies a little, or protein a little bit over here, and maybe you up ketone levels. It really depends on what the actual goal is for the person. And this is where it's important to understand when, let's say, higher protein is more important, again, body composition, or maybe higher ketones is more important, again, for neurological conditions and maybe mental health disorders.
Really important you went there with the calories, because there is this camp out there, and I feel like I've been part of it in the past, who assumes that as long as insulin's low, you can have as much fat as you want, and the body won't go into storage mode. So I think it's important that you highlighted that, and any other insight in that realm, I'd love you to bring forth.
Sure. So let's talk about that. So one of the primary examples that's often utilized is that, okay, if you reduce insulin almost completely in type 1 diabetes, no matter how much fat you consume, how many carbs you consume, how much protein you consume, you can't gain weight. 100% true. That's a great example of how important insulin is. Well, let's say you don't have type 1 diabetes and you don't completely forget to take your insulin, which is a normal metabolic system where insulin is always present, but it's going to be regulated by everything that's going on, okay? Well, carb intake's the most potent impact on insulin at each meal. So the higher the carbohydrates, the higher glucose, the higher the glucose, the higher the insulin. Protein is 2.5 times less glucose and insulin impact. As a result, not as much insulin, but still requires insulin. People often talk about you can consume more fat and you see no meaningful impact on insulin. There is studies that show this. However, it's all within context. Fat does not require the same insulin spike that carbohydrates do to be permissive of fat storage. That's important. So if you consume an unbelievable amount of fat, and I don't recommend anyone trying this, but I know people who have done this, who have said, okay, I'm just going to up more fat. In fact, there's actually examples of people who, actually crazy examples. There's people who go on these survival shows, okay, who actually try to survive for 100 plus days out in the wilderness. And usually most of those days they're starving, okay, they're fasting. Alone is a great example of this. There's actually a character on one of those shows who drank a bottle of olive oil every single day on top of what he was already doing to gain 50 pounds before he entered the competition. And he ended up winning it. It will cause you to gain weight, okay? But if you up your fat intake and you proportionally reduce other forms of food in the diet, like carbohydrates, then maybe you find yourself less hungry. And then maybe you find yourself not eating as many overarching calories. And then maybe as a result, you actually find yourself in a caloric restriction. What's important to realize is that calories are not the only factor that matter in weight loss. They're just the one factor that most reliably has consistently across almost virtually every trial ever conducted, it has been demonstrated to impact weight loss. That is different than the practical considerations of how you compose a diet while choosing foods that may have more or less insulinogenic impacts in order to optimize a ratio that one, you can adhere to, sustain to, that will also be something that will volitionally reduce your hunger cues so that you eat less calories by default. But calories are still important. I think virtually everyone who would at one point have said it don't matter is acknowledging they do matter, but it's always within the context in which they speak it. So pay particular attention to that. They're not saying calories don't matter, although they may actually state that statement. But then they'll also say, but by the way, here's the nuance to that, of which I'm trying to describe here, is that yes, there's plenty of nuance to this conversation. But one thing is abundantly clear, that if you load up the fat in the blood at high enough levels, and you actually see this in type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, in my opinion, gives one of the best examples of actually trying to elucidate this effect. And there's clear evidence that shows that dose-dependent elevations of fat in type 1 diabetes require dose-dependent elevations in insulin. Nowhere near as much as it would be the case for carbohydrates, but a meaningful elevation nonetheless, okay? Now, there's a lot of nuance there, but it's just one of many illustrations that fat quantity does matter, calories do matter, and you just want to find a balance. So it's about finding again, it's not trying to do like biohacks here or there. It's about designing the diet to optimize the outcome so that you're not always working against yourself to achieve your goal. Again, it's about the design of the diet that allows you to get there. That's the ecological mindset. That's the mindset of what's practical and what can people actually do. But if I say calories are all that matter, someone may just go start counting calories and try to reduce their calories. And that almost always fails people. Always fails people. So if you just follow that mindset, this is where a lot of people say, well, calories don't matter. Okay, well, they do matter, but maybe if you only thing you think about is counting calories, it will fail you. And that's obviously, there's some evidence that suggests that if you just focus on a practical perspective of reducing calories, it can be difficult to adhere to.
Okay, one other area in the fat realm I want to make sure we hit on is this belief I know I had in the past where it's not just about lowering carbs. You need a certain amount of fat in the diet to actually produce ketones. Tie that bit in.
If your goal is to lower body fat and you're able to lower your calories sufficiently by just consuming, let's say, a fibrous forms of carbohydrates, green leafy vegetables, prioritizing protein, and you're in a caloric deficit and you find you're losing weight, some people would say, okay, well, it might be good to consume fat so you're producing more ketones. Well, no. Your body's going to strip the fat off your body to make up for the deficit. So you don't have to consume fat to produce ketones. Your body will reliably do this on its own. And the best example of that is fasting, where the body will reliably shift towards stripping the predominant form of energy from fat that is stored to make up energy needs for the body, and it'll rapidly elevate ketone levels. So if you're in a caloric deficit and you don't get enough fat, your body's just going to take it from your own endogenous fat stores, which for many people is a desired outcome.
Okay, for people that still have the belief that we need to include this extra fat to produce ketones, would that actually block fat from being released from the body to produce ketones?
Yes.
Important nuance there. again, coming back to our metabolic health, people that are obese wanting to lose weight on this diet, if they have that assumption and they're stacking on the fat, they could be working against themselves. And you're saying they are.
Absolutely. Well, if they're trying to lose weight, they are. Okay. But keep in mind, if a little bit of extra fat helps you adhere to the diet more and you remain in a deficit and you're making progress towards your goal, then maybe that's more sustainable than someone who's trying to cut all the fat out and then they find that they're too ravenously hungry, they can't sustain the diet. Well, that's not a net benefit. So again, it's about this complex nuance of interactive factors that you work together to get the desired outcome.
Okay, bottom line, your body's going to find the fat either through the diet or the body. If you want to prioritize the body fat making the ketones, you actually don't want to include that extra fat in the diet.
You want to minimize including excess calories that are not necessary to sustain the diet. Let me say it that way, because the sustainability is the most important part. So if you're able to sustain the diet while not including those excess calories and you're trying to lose weight, then yes, you want to avoid those things. But if those extra calories are important to sustaining the diet, then that might be more important than not doing the diet at all.
Okay, but looking at fat specifically, to make those ketones, it's going to want fat either through the diet or from the body, correct?
Correct. And the best example of this is fasting. If you don't eat anything at all, no protein, no carbohydrates, no fat, the body is going to break down what it needs to from its own storage to ensure you have sufficient energy for your brain and various other tissues. So the body will always make sure that it has what it needs. And for most of us, we all almost universally, even the leanest of us, retain around 2 to 3 months at least of fat stores. And for some people, well over a year of fat stores. So that's just the best example to give as saying, okay, well, if you go into a deficit, will you be able to survive that? Absolutely. You can go into complete absence of any nutrients whatsoever and survive that. Not saying that's necessarily optimal, but it's just an example of how your body will work to ensure your survival using its own stored energy substrates, which is also why the body strategically stores fat, because the body wants to store as much energy because evolutionarily speaking, we would go through periods of feast and famine, and you'd want to have something you could reliably tap into for extended periods of time to ensure your survival. So as a result, we have built the machinery that allows for that, particularly for fat, which is the easiest to store and the hardest to lose.
All right, I want to come back to protein, make sure I fully understand the nuances there. We know that protein independently of the amount does stimulate insulin, less than carbs. But coming back to that bit I was talking about before, where 5-10 years ago, it seemed like more people were worried about taking in too much protein, having that bolus, and then creating glucose through gluconeogenesis. Somebody who isn't, say, having copious amounts of protein powder, they're having a healthy mixed diet, omnivore diet, is that ever a concern?
It's all in the context of the goal. So if the person wants to optimize body composition, they're lifting weights, they're an athlete, or they want to shift their calories towards more forms of calories that may help reduce their hunger so they're not tempted to overconsume on their diet, then protein is a idealistic way to prioritize as a macronutrient within the calories you're consuming within your diet. But I think there's grains of truth in every single one of these arguments. So this idea that if you consume too much, then it may cause an abundance of more glucose. It does. It does produce more. But again, your body's always been doing that. This is not some new revelation, by the way. This has been known for decades that if you consume more protein, you're going to release more glucose and then have more insulin. But people have been doing these ketogenic diets that have been highly protein focused, and they've been seeing huge amounts of benefit. This idea that protein is going to circumvent those benefits is not consistent with 200 years of data showing that just reducing the carbohydrates as the primary form of modification in the diet is the most powerful way to induce some additional therapeutic benefit from that dietary strategy. So again, keep in mind, this has been done for 200 years in this way. In fact, mostly what was done over 200 years ago was just reducing carbs. That was what was done. It wasn't necessarily a focus around more or less fat, more or less protein. It was just reducing carbs of any form. in the diet, and then they were seeing these profound benefits for people who had obesity and diabetes and otherwise. So it's only now the conversation has got into this like optimization discussion. But keep in mind, for most people, they're the farthest from optimized. They're struggling with metabolic health issues. They're not anywhere close to optimal. So simply shifting towards a tool that reliably works and doing it in a consistent way is one of the most powerful steps they can take on their health journey, and not get too bogged down in the nitty-gritty detail of, okay, will this stimulate more gluconeogenesis and insulin? Well, yeah, it does, but guess what? It doesn't really matter, does it? Because for 200 years, they've been doing that just fine. So again, it is not like people are wrong when they state that. It's accurate, but to be overly concerned about it as it's going to forego their benefits from the diet, as I think misguided.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
A very low carbohydrate and very high fat diet, known as the ketogenic diet, has been known to have powerful metabolic changes. When people utilize these high carbohydrate diets since the 1970s as the one optimal form of diet, it is